Tom, if you were in charge of the world, like the whole world, what is the first policy that you would bring in? What would be day one, Tom Praviti's administration, go?
It's a tough question. I mean, other than mandating everybody listen to the carbon removal show.
I mean, it is a difficult question. That's why not everyone's a politician.
It's a very difficult question. What would you pick, Emily?
I mean, that's okay. You can have a light first day, just getting into it.
Yeah, maybe I don't want to go too hard from day one.
Yeah. I think I would tax the billionaires. That would be the first thing I'd do.
Oh yeah, I'd put that straight into carbon removal. There we go.
Billionaires
Create
fund
coalition.
carbon removal. And then I'd also maybe just gift everyone some freshly baked cookies or something, just as a nice little welcome to the Swaddle administration.
I mean, you do make a good banana bread.
Thank you so much.
Right, so until I'm in charge and make everyone listen to podcasts and you tax the billionaires, I think we're going to have to muddle our way through the policy landscape.
Yeah, I suppose we should spend some time thinking about what other people do in policy, because nobody's listening to our policies just yet.
No, and they might have a point.
Hello, Tom Praviti.
Hello, Emily Swaddle.
And hello, lovely listeners.
Welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show.
So, are you ready, Tom?
You know what? I think I am ready.
Good. It's here. We're actually doing it.
Are you ready, Emily?
I am so ready. So ready for this.
Today, listeners, begins the Carbon Removal Show deep dive on, drumroll, carbon removal policy.
And it's been a long time coming. Policy has been one of those things that's cropped up everywhere along our CDR learning journey, unsurprisingly, I guess. And because it's always seemed like a big, complex, scary thing, we've sort of skimmed over it, pinned it for another day.
Yeah, the classic, we'll circle back to that. We'll promise to circle back. But we don't make promises that we can't deliver on this show. It felt like we just couldn't put it off any longer. And having dedicated season 3 to exploring how the CDR industry can scale up, policy just felt like the missing piece in that puzzle.
And now also feels like the right time. There is a lot of movement happening policy-wise right now. Some of it is positive. There is a lot of uncertainty. And there are some dates and deadlines looming on the horizon. 2025 looks like it's going to be a big year for CDR policy, maybe the biggest yet.
Possibly. Very exciting.
Let's see.
As always, we endeavour to use this show to thoroughly dig into complex topics and unscramble them a bit. As you mentioned, Emily, policy is a big, scary thing that a lot of people, even those working every day in CDR, myself included, struggle to get their heads around.
Yeah, I definitely align with the bury my head in the sanders when it comes to CDR policy.
Ostriching your way through this scrambled puzzle.
But honestly, it really is a tricky one, this. And, we get to chit-chat with a lot of people who work in CDR. And in their most honest moments, I can tell you that a lot of people have admitted that they struggle to keep up with all this.
Sounds like me. Carbon confession. I really am not on top of all the policy stuff.
So we're doing this mini-series for all of them and for all of you, as well as for ourselves.
Most importantly, for ourselves.
Even if no one listens.
We're going to spend the next 3 episodes building our collective understanding of what CDR policy is, why it's important, and what we should be looking out for. We're not going to do an exhaustive overview of every CDR policy that ever existed, but we are hoping to help you find the lay of the land so that you can continue with your own research in your own time.
We have gathered a lot of experts and CDR voices to talk to us about this, both those who work directly on policy and those who interact with it. Really some very big names with enormous expertise, and it is so useful to hear their insights. I'm really excited to share it all with you.
We're going to be starting from the beginning, because that's essentially where we all started from with all this policy stuff.
Yes. Much like on season 1 of the Carbon Removal Show, you'll remember, Tom, way back at the beginning, we did not assume our lovely listeners had any knowledge of carbon removal or what it looks like. We didn't have that much knowledge of carbon removal or what it looks like. And we were all in the same boat, learning episode by episode. Now we're taking the same approach to CDR policy. If you need an intro or a refresher on what carbon removal is and what it does, head back to season 1. We'll be here waiting for you when you're ready to get into policy.
Maybe I should go back to season 1 for a bit, just to
Need a
remind
refresher.
myself. Exactly. So if you're a CDR policy beginner, we've got you. And if you already have a bit of knowledge or background here, we've got some treats for you too. We have a tightly structured, content-rich, juicy little mini-series ahead of us, so stay tuned.
Juicy indeed. Tight and juicy. In this first episode of our policy excursion, we'll be asking, what do we mean when we're talking about CDR policy? Why do we need it? And why do we all need to know about it?
Okay, enough dilly-dallying. Let's just go.
Let's go. Let's start with why. Why do we need CDR policy? Maybe it's obvious. We're all on board with the need for climate action, and of course, policy is one important lever in achieving this.
I believe that there's almost no mature industry in the world today that's scaled without considerable policy support. And we can see that both in traditional industries, you can look at basic commodity production, you can look at car production, at planes, but you can also see it in the climate space, right? If you think about PV or solar, that really stemmed from early government support in Germany, starting in the 70s and 80s and going all the way until the Chinese took over and essentially scaled it to oblivion. This is just a basic fact of how the scale-up of any industry works. CDR is no different.
That was Sebastian Manhart, someone you will have heard of before if you're a long-time listener to this show. He is the Senior Policy Advisor at Carbon Future and one of the hosts of the CDR Policy Scoop podcast. A very apt guest for this mini-series, wouldn't you say, Tom?
Very apt indeed. When it comes to CDR in particular, individuals, companies, and markets aren't going to solve a challenge of this magnitude without any kind of political support or input. So, firstly, we want policy that supports the development of and helps scale carbon removal.
If anything, CDR, because it's very science and technology and innovation heavy, can benefit even more from early government support. And given where we are today, it's both essential for the development of the industry, but also, frankly, carbon removal is quite unique in the sense that the commodity it produces doesn't have an immediate use for a customer, for an individual. We are trapping an invisible gas and locking it away.
This is something that we've mentioned before. CDR is not a consumer product. So in order to make sure people are doing it and people are funding it, it makes sense that we'll need some policy support. Although the question of how much support and what kind and from where exactly is still up for debate.
And CDR does have its own kind of challenges to face, which, compared to some other industries, are pretty big obstacles. Some CDR technologies are really capital intensive. Some need access to large amounts of land. So policy intervention can maybe help overcome these obstacles, especially in the scaling phase.
Another important way in which policy can impact this industry is ensuring that carbon removal is done well. And by well, I mean honestly, fairly, sustainably, and ethically. As with any industry, and particularly those that require large-scale infrastructure or are at the cutting edge of new technologies, we do need some sort of regulation and guidance to ensure that everyone stays on the right track.
Here's Will Burns, co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at the American University.
There are always folks engaged in game playing, right? One of the things that we saw recently in the emissions avoidance markets, tree planting, was evidence of massive overclaims of the amount of reductions in the felling of trees associated with these market-based sort of mechanisms, right? And that really undermines public confidence and government confidence that these kind of approaches that, albeit potentially increasing the political ease of climate policy and making it more economically efficient, can at the same time really fundamentally undermine faith in the integrity of the system. And we're worried about that in the context of carbon removal. Are we going to be able to meaningfully measure for some of the kinds of carbon removal that we're talking about in so-called open systems, things like enhanced rock weathering or ocean-based approaches? Can we realistically measure how much CO2 is being sequestered? Can we do it in a way that doesn't undermine maintaining our efforts to do job one, right, which is to reduce emissions? Can we do it in a way that protects the interests of communities?
We know that there are fears around CDR and its applications, fears and skepticism. And some of that feels just a bit alarmist, but some of the concerns are very valid. It's easy to imagine companies making a lot of money from activities that aren't having the impact they claim, or to imagine a world where CDR is playing a big role but has other negative consequences, or where important questions of durability, for instance, are ignored. From the beginning of this show, all the way back in season 1, we've talked about the importance of doing CDR right and the opportunity we have to build a robust system around that from the offset.
So we did that from the offset.
Offset from the carbon
offset.
offset.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no point in doing it if the net impact is going to be a negative one. Ensuring CDR is done well is also going to be vital to gain trust and wider support for these technologies. So these two approaches really go hand in hand, and both are sort of essential to scaling the industry.
100%. These two aims for CDR policy, supporting industry scaling and guiding ethical practice, are big ones, but they are not exhaustive. We'll be looking at more ways in which policy can work for CDR as we go.
Okay, so how are we actually doing with CDR policy so far? What does the current picture look like? Through this series, we're going to be discovering that while we've made important progress in recent years, we've still got a lot of work to do. Bojana Bazzelj, VP of Carbon Removal at B0, shared her perspective on where we find ourselves at this moment in time.
I think we're still quite a way away from having a very comprehensive climate policy for carbon removal. I think where we need to get to is to have basically two main things that are done by the policy. One is that policy must clearly stipulate who has the responsibility to pay for carbon removal and how much they should pay. And the second point is the policy should also establish these ground rules for quality and safety of the carbon removal deployment. But yeah, we're still quite far away from having an actual comprehensive package that works together rather than kind of against each other. There are some specific policies that have been helping, like, the 45Q tax credit in the US, the subsidies in some individual EU member states like Denmark. All of these have helped. I don't think any of them had like a really transformative, massive uptake, which is also in a way not unexpected. Like policy takes time to kind of have a hold because project developers and investors want to see stability. Like they don't want policies come in, be taken away, vice versa, because we're dealing with something that it's a product that will only have a value if there is a clear rules around what we do with it. So we're kind of starting to build this policy, package, but we're still in early days, I would say.
What Bojana underlines here is actually why I personally think it's so important that we make this mini-series. All of us working in or interacting with carbon removal, we really need to understand how this works so that we can all contribute to building the frameworks that we need for this industry to thrive and to scale.
Okay, I, for one, love to zoom out. I love rewinding back to literally the very beginning because it helps me get clarity on whatever I'm looking at. So let's start by looking at the whole wider context of climate and environmental policy so that we can understand where CDR fits within this bigger picture.
Yeah, I like that plan. Carbon removal might be a relatively young field, but there's of course a whole history of climate and environmental action, some of which we've covered before. You might remember in season 3, Emily, that we discussed the Montreal Treaty.
Do I remember that? I think I need more context.
Well, It was about the management and elimination of ozone-depleting chemicals.
Ah, yes, the ozone one. If you'd have called it that, I might have remembered. But now I do remember what you're talking about.
It was a real success story, the most widely ratified treaty ever, and it's gone a long way to healing the hole in the ozone.
Yeah. No, I do remember. We discussed it in our analogies episode, I remember, as a positive example of huge scale change.
That's the one. The effort to control ozone-depleting chemicals is just one of many initiatives at local, national, and international levels, impacting everything from biodiversity, waste, energy, to oceans. In fact, the more that you look, the more you see that so much of public policy impacts our planet and environment in direct and indirect ways. Loads of things could be considered environmental policy, but when we're talking about carbon removal, it makes most sense to start with the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you set the scene a little bit for us in terms of, like, historically, what is the context of climate policy that CDR is coming into?
So we have to get started way back, slightly before the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the UNFCCC.
This is Eva Tammer, member of the European Commission's Expert Group on Carbon Removals, Managing Director of Climate Principles, and the other co-host of the CDR Policy Scoop.
That's the first treaty that really set the groundwork for global climate action. Before that, we didn't have anything similar. And what informed that work was the establishment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was established back in 1988. And then in 1992, we got the convention. So this is where climate policy on the international level really started happening. As many of your listeners will know, what followed was Kyoto Protocol, because it set the first legally binding targets for developed countries. And it was really the first agreement that focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally.
Ah, Kyoto is one I have heard of.
I'd be surprised if you hadn't, Emily. It's a pretty well-known one.
Mm-hmm. Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997 and came into force in 2005. And really, so much has emerged out of this pioneering agreement in the years since. To our surprise, actually, Ava told us that CDR was kind of there from the beginning.
What many people don't know who work on CDR is that we also had removal units under Kyoto Protocol. And these are being used by governments to help achieve their Kyoto Protocol targets. Of course, at the time, the targets were not what we are used to seeing these days. The European Union's target for the first trading period, so that was 2008 to 2012, it was 8% of reductions compared to 1990. You know, these days, the numbers are very different, so it may sound like peanuts. But that really was the source of so many more things that came from it.
I was really interested to hear you were talking about even that in the early days, the protocols included things for CDR. Many people don't know that. I didn't know that.
Yes, I know, because almost any time I mention it, it comes as a surprise. Of course, it was about forestry-based removals, so afforestation, reforestation, but that's where we are coming from, and I think it has also informed a lot what has happened on especially forestry-based removals since. So important developments there. But if you look at what Kyoto Protocol did, first of all, obviously the targets were, not really comparable what's on the table today. And also it was quite short term because, the first targets had to be achieved in this 5 years between 2008 and 2012. And then we had a second period, which was a bit longer, from 2013 to 2020. So it was all kind of short term. And then obviously everyone knew that we had to negotiate something else for later. And that completely changed with the Paris Agreement, because now we have really long-term vision. We have the goal of balancing the sources and sinks in the second half of the century. We have the temperature goal, below 2 degrees, pursuing 1.5 degrees. So we don't anymore need to continue negotiating new treaties every 10 or so years because we have a long-term vision. And of course, balancing sources and sinks is a very different target compared to the previous, where we had 5% or 8%, on different developed countries. And of course, now everyone has targets. So we have come with this Paris Agreement to a very different reality.
The Paris Agreement, that's another big one.
Big one indeed. Possibly the biggest.
The Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, establishes emissions reductions targets for countries, including commitments from all major polluting countries, and crucially, puts us on a pathway towards net zero. So, that's our whistle-stop tour of the history of international climate policy.
And this actually brings us nicely to what this means for CDR. Because, as you say, Emily, we're now talking net zero. And that net means it's not just about reducing emissions, but also removing that carbon from the atmosphere.
Yes. As Ava said, back in 1997, Kyoto did have allowances for removals with several market-based mechanisms under which removals were recognised. But back then we were only talking about land use change, and forestry activities such as reforestation and afforestation. What we now call novel or engineered CDR methods, so that's DACs, BECs, biochar, enhanced rock weathering, they weren't in the picture yet at all. However, in the last couple of decades, they have started to be taken into consideration as possible tools for helping us reach our climate targets.
My name is Christoph Beutler. I'm the CEO of Carbon Gap, and this year is my 10th year in CDR.
10 years.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It's about 8 years longer than most people. So, almost a decade before most of us had even heard of CDR, Christoph found himself at the vanguard of exploring what these new technological possibilities might mean for climate policy.
In 2015, I joined a Swiss think tank / NGO that was looking at long-term risk to societies. And we found that there's this topic in the IPCC AR4 report at the time that is now known as a CDR. And we also found out that nobody knew about this, and that not even the climate people in the federal offices of the environment in Switzerland or Germany knew about this topic. So that's how it started. We basically got a project together with the Swiss Ministry of the Environment to kind of educate them and also kind of put the topic on the agenda. So it was very, very much a scientific topic until the mid-2010s when this went into political discussions, and it was a small group of scientists as well. And I like to think that the project we did in Switzerland was probably one of the first ones that bridged the gap between science and policy.
At the time, the term carbon removal didn't really exist, at least in the forms that we know it today. So the report references geoengineering methods for capturing and safely sequestering CO2.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
Just a slight one. And it does make early mention of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECS. But by the fifth assessment report, 7 years later, CDR was referred to by the name that we now know and love, and methods such as BECS were receiving more serious consideration.
Advancements in science and technology were beginning to meet up with the problem facing policymakers. Could CDR work alongside decarbonisation to help us reach climate targets? After all, decarbonisation was not, and is not, going fast enough to reach those goals. And in many industries, reaching net zero without removals by 2050 just is not politically or economically credible. CDR was a potential bridge between the practicalities of decarbonisation and the climate goals set to avoid the worst effects of climate breakdown.
And the need for that bridge was further cemented in 2018, when the IPCC's latest projections for staying within 1.5 degrees and reaching net zero by 2050 all included significant amounts of durable CDR.
Great. Sounds like we're sorted then. Policymakers needed CDR, scientists backed it. Everyone's on board, right?
If only it were that simple.
Yeah, it never is.
Even from these early days, there were worries that a reliance on CDR would shift the focus of climate targets away from decarbonisation and actually give big polluters a license to keep polluting. No need to cut down on emissions if you can just remove them, right? CDR was in fact known as the dangerous distraction.
Not a nickname that's very reassuring, is it?
No.
This may sound like an ethical question, but it's actually also a political one, because the pace and shape of decarbonisation over the coming decades isn't merely a matter of what is technically possible. It's also likely to depend on what's economically and politically palatable. How we move forward is not all in the hands of big polluters, because they can be regulated. And those regulations can shape how much decarbonisation we can achieve, how quickly, and therefore how much CDR we should expect or plan to use in order to plug the remaining gap.
Here's Robert Höglund, co-founder of CDR FYI, head of carbon strategy and CDR at Milky Wire, and member of the European Commission expert group on carbon removals.
The key role that carbon removal plays when it comes to these NDCs and these targets is to help reach net zero in a faster and cheaper and in a more effective way. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around this, like what you have to use CDR for, like what are the targets even for? Should CDR only be for some strictly put together list of residual emissions, where residual mean allowed, basically, emissions, rather than just the original meaning of residual will be like whatever's left. But some people use residual as in like either unavoidable or like allowed emissions. Either you see it in that way, or you see it more as a tool that you could use for the emissions where it makes most sense. So aviation could be one sector where continuing to use jet fuel, but using permanent carbon removal to neutralize it could be the most cost-effective solution, at least in the midterms. But that will still be kind of a limited amount of sectors. It's not going to be for a big part of emissions.
Within that need, like there's talk of sort of like however many gigatons by whatever year. Do you think that those milestones are helpful? And like, if so, what kind of milestones do we need to hit? What are we aiming for?
You need to have some kind of idea of roughly how much you think you're going to need, because you need to plan and try to make projections of how to reach that. And it is, of course, very difficult to say how much is going to be needed for net zero, because that depends on the technology development in other sectors. If someone comes up with an electrofuel for aviation that's like dirt cheap and it's a completely novel method, then that will make CDR unnecessary for aviation, for example. But that kind of range of a few gigatons, like the SBTI has 10% of emissions, which would be around 4 billion tons across the global economy for net zero. I think most people are having their minds like somewhere around that. But the biggest role of CDR is not net zero, really. It is to bring down temperatures. We're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees for sure. Like it's like a couple of years left of the CO2 budget. And if we're ever going to return to 1.5 degrees, then carbon removal is the only thing that can do that. And that's where the biggest need for CDR is.
As Robert highlights, finding the optimal amount of CDR to use over the coming decades will in part be determined by economics. The question is, where can CDR get us to net zero cheaper and faster than decarbonisation? But he also points out that we can't just expect the perfect amount of CDR to magically materialise when we need it. CDR doesn't just grow on trees.
Actually, Tom, it kind of does. That was a bad metaphor to use.
You're right. Let's leave the trees out to avoid confusion for now.
But you are right, Tom. The scale at which we need CDR isn't going to appear from nowhere. It will take time and it will take resourcing. Failing to plan ahead and begin to grow this industry now will endanger those net zero targets. Policymakers need to plan for this. Are you listening, policymakers? Can you hear me? You need to plan for this.
Also, when we're thinking about how much of our net zero progress comes from decarbonisation and how much comes from removals, there are some reasons not to be entirely neutral on this. Here's Will Burns, who we heard from earlier, with an environmental justice perspective.
One broad issue, certainly in the United States for the environmental justice community, is will a commitment to carbon removal facilitate extending the lifetime of the fossil fuel industry? And the worry there in many cases is even if carbon removal effectively removes CO2 from the atmosphere, if it permits fossil fuel companies to operate longer, all of the other pollutants associated with fossil fuel production, many of which disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, will continue, right? And that's an EJ issue.
Okay, so what have we learned about how CDR fits into climate policy from this brief history lesson? CDR in part emerged as a gap plugger. Emissions reductions targets have become increasingly ambitious, and yet reductions alone are very unlikely to get us to our climate goals on schedule. The IPCC confirmed that. So, CDR is here to help.
But we've also seen that there are some good arguments to consider CDR on its own terms, not just as a solution to the CO2 +1 - 1 = 0 mass problem. Partly because we don't want to create a space for CDR to take the pressure off decarbonisation, and partly because we need to know how, when, and how much these methods are going to need to scale. So we do have to give development of CDR our attention.
Finally, I think it's worth reflecting on the post-2050 world that Robert alluded to. CDR as a route back to 1.5 degrees. Many scientists agree that we have now surpassed the possibility of staying within 1.5 degrees of warming. Heartbreaking but true. So once we hit net zero, the role for CDR will likely not be merely to continue to counterbalance any residual emissions, but to go beyond this and compensate for any overshoot. CDR could help bring us back down to within 1.5 degrees after we've reached the net zero target. Again, policymakers need to be taking an incredibly long-term view here, which is super hard, and particularly where political terms and mandates are counted in years rather than decades.
I don't know about you, Emily, but I cannot wait for the post-net zero removals heyday. I am biased, but I do believe CDR is going to help us save the world.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we're around to see it, the heyday.
If we're still alive.
Yeah. We have some ways to go, but here's hoping we get there. Now we know where we need to go. How is this all going to work exactly?
A very good question. Let's look at some of the mechanics of all this.
So, starting at the top, the UN is, of course, the highest level of climate law.
But we also want to think about national laws, local government, and municipal initiatives.
Right. I am personally interested in how all of these levels of the policy framework interact with each other. Sebastian Manhart gave us a way to think about the top tiers of this relationship.
So the nationally determined contributions and kind of net zero targets are the North Star of the fight against climate change, right? Like that is the overarching goal, the overarching metric that we can all work towards. And it's something that we've agreed on globally. Some countries have very late net zero targets. They have in 2070, right? Some in 2035. So it's a broad range. And what counts as removal, for example, within net zero targets, every country kind of makes it up as they want. So it's actually very different. And we risk achieving net zero, but not really achieving net zero. So we can spend a lot of time just talking about nationally determined contributions. But they are the North Star of what we need to do here. Now, within that, we can start embedding a lot of different policies, right? Once we've got the net zero, the next thing you should do is have intermediate targets, whether you are corporate or whether you're government. It's kind of a cop-out if you have a 2050 target with nothing in between, because you can kind of do whatever you want and just push it to other generations.
Sebastian mentions NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, which are essentially the pieces of the global net zero puzzle that each nation will be responsible for. If global net zero is a pie, each country's NDC is their declaration of how big their slice will be. And those interim targets are the beginning of putting meat on the bones of these NDCs.
Ah, okay, so it's a meat pie. I see. I was picturing kind of, pumpkin pie or a nice lemon tart or something. It's okay.
Yeah, meat pie with bones, I guess. I'm not committed to any of these metaphors at the moment.
That's okay, we get the gist. NDCs are the high-level goals for individual countries. Interim targets are broad strokes of how they might get there.
Yeah, bony meat pie. The big goals of the NDCs, matched with the interim targets, offer a sense of timeline and pace of change. It helps to determine what measures countries will need to take and by when. Crucially, this can bring clarity to the role that CDR is going to play in contributing to these emissions goals.
Yes, but of course, the way in which these translate into action differs from country to country.
In Europe, for example, we've got a 2030 target. We're now developing a 2040 target, and we've got a 2050 target. Countries like Switzerland or Germany, Switzerland already has 2035, 40, 45. Germany's developing 35, 40, 45 targets, right? That's kind of a best practice. And that's the next level down. So we got net zero, then we've got kind of the stacked milestones. And when we have that, we can develop policy to get there. If I know in 2035, I need whatever, 5% carbon removal, then I know how many emissions I'm likely to have in that year. I know I need to achieve in Europe, I'm just making this up, but in Europe 2040, we might need to achieve 75 megatons of tech CDR, according to an impact assessment from the European Commission. 75 tons, now I know I need to develop policy. I look at my different vehicles. I know this one does 20, this one can do 30. But again, if we miss the top guiding star, which is, for example, what we have in the US, right? The US doesn't have the climate target focus that Europe has. And so climate policy is very much done bottom up. We're going to put 300 billion into this because we know it's the right thing to do. But we don't actually know how that ties into the overall mission. Whereas in Europe, we start with the overall mission and then we work backwards, which takes longer, but frankly, I think is more sustainable.
The difference between what policy looks like and how it's made in, for instance, the EU versus the US will be a recurring theme in these episodes. And this particular contrast is obviously quite timely, given the United States' recent shift away from its climate commitments.
The types of policy and what those policies focus on are also, of course, very context dependent, so they will differ across jurisdictions too. As we've explored in the past, some countries are more suited to particular types of CDR, based on their natural resources, for example, or labour costs, existing infrastructure, and so on. Head back to season 1 if you want to hear more about this. So even on the basic question of what type of CDR to support, these decisions will often need to be made at the country level or perhaps even more locally. Let's talk about what options policymakers have in terms of types of policy.
Okay, well, we've touched on the fact that we need policies that support CDR and those that regulate it.
And there are also ways in which those types overlap and interact. Let's focus firstly on the former. When it comes to policies that support the development and scaling of carbon removal, there's a pretty common breakdown that Sebastian shares here. Common breakdown. Sounds like the story of my life.
When you think about policy, I would break it down in kind of two simple buckets, demand and supply side. Governments can essentially support carbon removal either by boosting demand. Examples of that would be direct procurement, for example, of carbon removal. Another example would be the integration of carbon removal in compliance markets or emission trading systems. On the supply side, it can essentially make it easier for companies to even produce the carbon removal. This can be tax credits. This can be capex support to build the facilities. There's a number of different ways you can do this, but it always falls in one of these two buckets, and we need both. So when we think about kind of how do we design policy to scale carbon removal, one way to think about it is demand supply. And the second lens that I would put on top of this is not all carbon removal is created equal. And so the different technologies will require, based on their maturity level, different types of policy support. So you have demand supply, plus, depending on maturity scale, different types of interventions.
So in the case of CDR, demand-side policies are those that will make it easier, more cost-effective, or less risky for buyers to engage in carbon removal. While supply-side policies are those that will help suppliers to enter the market and scale up from there.
Yes, and obviously these can be mutually supportive. More buyers means more opportunities for suppliers to sell. But for the growth of this industry, particularly if we want this scaling to be rapid, both sides of the equation are pretty crucial.
Just as a reminder for listeners, Buyers for durable CDR credits globally currently sit in the low three figures, while the percentage of sold credits delivered sits at around 5%. That's obviously the side the suppliers manage. Both these numbers are going to need to grow if CDR is going to keep up its momentum.
Fortunately, there are, at least in theory, many forms these measures can take. Here's Chris Neidel, policy specialist, co-founder of the Open Air Collective and director and co-founder of Four Corners Carbon Coalition, looking at the demand side.
On the demand side, there's many different ways in which that can happen. That's obviously absolutely critical when we're dealing with carbon removal. There needs to be people that want to buy, either the direct carbon removals themselves or for those types of pathways that have clear other benefits that might be marketable or have a market value. So in terms of how that could be done, it depends on which level, of government that it's being pursued. But the main categories of it, anywhere where there's sort of already some form of compliance framework for emissions reduction, a cap and trade type of program, CDR can figure into that as an element where polluting entities are compelled or incentivized to support carbon removals, and that support counts towards the broader objective of what that compliance scheme has vis-a-vis like net zero, right? So certainly worldwide, there's a lot of schemes like that, both at the national and at the subnational level. In the US, at the federal level, we do not have such a compliance framework and are certainly not going to have one anytime soon. But a number of states that are sort of the climate forward states, some of the largest states in the country, do have those: California, New York, Massachusetts, Washington, Colorado. So there we look to see, are there opportunities to sort of fold CDR obligation into those. Other approaches that are really quite attractive are what you could broadly call as public procurement models. And that is where, the government entity decides that it's going to make direct purchases of carbon removal. There's other things too with tax policy that are quite interesting. You can look at ways of giving tax credits to, CDR implementers, let's say farmers that implement carbon farming practices. Instead of doing procurement of those credits, can you give a sort of a performance-based tax credit to implementers of those types of practices? You can do the same for utilizers of carbon-based materials in concrete and construction, or even in geological storage. And then there's also things of creating, this is kind of a newer area, where can you create tax credits or tax rebates for purchasers of carbon credits, as a way of sort of closing the gap on the very high premium that anyone who's in the carbon credit market, whose frame of reference might be cheap tree offsets, in order to make them enter the arena for buying carbon removals. If you can, offer a tax credit potentially that would help cover some of the delta between what the cost of that is versus what conventional offsets are.
So we're seeing a really broad range of approaches, even just on the demand side. In the past on this show, we've alluded to developing compliance markets, which would mean including CDR in companies' mandated climate targets, and that's obviously something we'll explore further in the series. But beyond that, there are other financial measures that governments can take to encourage the buying of CDR.
And again, we can see these layers of policy in action. As Chris highlights, where there are gaps in the federal level in the US, states can fill in by providing more ambitious or more comprehensive interventions. The same is the case in other federal systems, or even in countries with more centralized governments, where local government can step in to play a role.
It's nice to think that everyone can chip in every now and again to make sure that policy is robust and working towards those big climate targets.
Yes, that's the ideal. Meanwhile, on the supply side, there are similarly a host of options. Funding for research and development to support innovation, so exploring new methods of carbon removal or exploring how to efficiently scale existing ones. There are tax credits for suppliers, that's a big one, and a range of policies that create a more supportive environment, such as relevant infrastructure spending and streamlining permitting and regulation.
Tax credits are certainly a big one, but it's not just about cash. While so many of the policies we'll be looking at through this series do involve some level of financial support, either for buyers or suppliers, we can't forget again that CDR is going to be interacting with a whole landscape of policy that already exists or soon will. And at the very least, we don't want that policy getting in the way of the healthy development of this industry.
Yes, lots of moving parts to keep our eyes on. So maybe when we're talking about CDR policy, we shouldn't just focus on policies for and about CDR, but also those that have impacts on CDR, either directly or indirectly. We've got to look at the big picture here, Tom.
You mean like the infrastructure that's required around CDR?
Yeah, exactly. Think about something like BECS or DACS. There's a huge amount of infrastructure needed for those solutions.
Yeah, I mean, DAX in particular needs abundant, cheap, renewable energy to be at all viable, which of course requires its own policy support.
Yeah, and both DACS and BECS need infrastructure for actually storing the carbon, that vital part at the end of these processes, and the S at the end of the handy acronyms.
And I suppose even when we're talking about land or biomass-based approaches, there are going to be policies like environmental regulations that come into play because making changes to how land is used and what's growing on it or going into it impacts everything from water to biodiversity to food systems.
Totally. CDR does not operate in a vacuum. It may be acting as a little vacuum cleaner for our atmosphere, but it's not operating within a vacuum.
It's a tough job hoovering up all that CO2. Can't happen in isolation.
Yeah, and so CDR technologies and operations are inevitably going to brush up against layers and layers of regulation that have been put in place over very many years. When we're thinking about what future regulations and policies look like across the board, the best way for them to support CDR is for policymakers to keep removals in mind as they're designing their regulations. And when we're talking about CDR methods that might cross jurisdictional boundaries, this gets a whole lot more complex. Here's Will Burns again.
Some of the approaches that don't have transboundary sort of impacts and look like things that we've already been doing, more conducive to regulation and more conducive to national or state and local regulation, right? Which in many ways makes things easier because you don't have the same kind of coordination issues you have with approaches that require international regulation. So things such as biochar, for example, or direct air capture, it can, for the most part, be pretty easily regulated with existing sort of statutes. You can determine if these projects pass the threshold to require environmental impact assessment, which almost invariably, certainly large industrial facilities like direct air capture do. And then you can use your traditional sort of risk assessment frameworks to effectuate the kind of regulation that you need. On the other hand, we have some approaches where it's unclear whether what we have in place is fit for purpose, right? One is the ocean-based approaches. And this is true both domestically to some degree, or certainly in the United States at least, and internationally, right? So at the international level, you have a regime called the London Convention and Protocol that have sought to regulate these approaches, but they're not there yet. The convention passed a resolution that's not legally binding years ago, and it was just focused on ocean iron fertilization. The protocol passed an amendment to the treaty that could regulate anything that constitutes marine geoengineering, but it to date has only listed ocean iron fertilization, and the amendment hasn't come into force because very few countries have actually accepted the amendment, right? And they're casting about to figure out what other marine-based approaches that involve depositing materials in the ocean should be regulated. It's not clear. And what else isn't clear is how we get from what they're initially permitting, which is scientific research only, to a point where these approaches could be commercially deployed. And their original ideas of limiting this kind of work to scientific research is based on the precautionary principle, right? And in many ways, I think is salutary. But what they haven't done in London, in my opinion, is provide any kind of meaningful sort of guidelines that would signal when we could move to a next stage. So there has to be some signals of what stage gating looks like, in my opinion, for the research, and then to potentially get a green light to be able to use these processes.
I think one of the reasons that I found this chat with Will so interesting is that It really reminded me how there's this deep history of environmental regulation that those of us focusing on carbon sometimes forget about. And this regulation has rarely been straightforward, and victories have been hard won.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty used to poring over the discussions and outcomes from the latest COP, but carbon is just one part of the picture. And protecting our oceans is obviously incredibly important for marine ecosystems and coastal communities.
Yeah, totally. And that's why, of course, marine CDR needs to be regulated in some way. As we explored in season 2, our oceans are complex, interconnected ecosystems. And just because we draw a line on a map, it doesn't mean that chemical and ecological changes to them don't spread beyond that. In fact, 40% of our oceans fall outside of national jurisdictions entirely. They're known as common oceans, and we're all jointly responsible for them. Nobody told me that. Nobody told me that I was jointly responsible for like 40% of the oceans. And here I am learning it in my 30s. Crikey, Moses.
It's a big responsibility.
Yeah, I know, and I would have taken it more seriously if I'd have known. So we really need international agreement as to how these new technologies might be deployed. But as Will highlights, interacting with international agreements that already face their own hurdles, it's going to be tricky.
That's a big challenge because without a path to commercialization, the potential for marine CDR to contribute to our climate goals is unlikely to be realized anytime soon. I guess solving this is going to mean putting CDR up the policy agenda, and not just as part of the carbon conversation, but more broadly.
Yeah, agreed. However, Tom, I think there's some good news to be found when looking back at some of this existing environmental and climate legislation. And this is a little bit of a full circle moment for us.
We do love a circling back, or a full circle.
Anything kind of like round and aesthetically pleasing. Early in this episode, we looked back at the history of international climate agreements. And I think to wrap up, I think we should remember that this whole background of existing policy isn't just something we need to interact with, but something we can learn from. Bojana from B0, who we heard from at the top of this episode, spoke about the evolution of biofuels in the EU as an example.
Actually, a lot of our energy and a lot of our fossil fuel emissions are not only associated with electricity, a lot of it is in transport, where we're using liquid fuels to power our cars and trucks, and that is a little bit more less straightforward in a way to solve for. And yes, in kind of mid-2000s, the main idea of solving this was to replace fossil fuels with biofuels. But initially, there wasn't much of an awareness that in order for you to, say, grow corn out of which you can make corn ethanol, or grow wheat out of which you can also make something like bioethanol, there's a lot of activities that also cause emissions in doing that. You need to put fertilizer on land in order to grow the corn. And also, maybe even more crucially, if you're taking land away from food production, you will probably need to replace that somewhere else, and that might lead into deforestation. So you're basically displacing food production into areas that currently are used as natural habitats or have forest cover, and now we need to chop the trees down to make space to grow the food that we're now no longer growing, and we're producing biofuels. So this is called indirect land use change. So the original policy package, which I believe came out around 2009, just mandated the percentage of in transport that needs to come from biofuels. Then a lot of criticism got started because maybe that didn't correctly take into account all of the emissions that go into growing crops, and also didn't take into consideration this indirect land use change. And then I believe in 2018, this was then kind of corrected by, increasing the sustainability standards and putting in provisions of how to try to avoid indirect land use change. And I think there's correlation here for CDR, both indirect, because there might be some similar things happening with CDR, but also quite direct, because kind of a majority of CDR is related to biomass, or will be done through biomass. And there's something that biofuels and biomass-based CDR have in common. There's a big overlap there. So in a way, what this shows us is that there are definitely examples where policy was put in place, implementation got started, and then it was course corrected. I think in a way the thing to learn here is to try and avoid and get it right the first way, but also at the same time know that if we do get some details wrong, we can course correct, and we have done that in the past.
So, with biofuels, we've got a 20-year history of EU policy finding its way. First, in supporting the phase in of biofuels, and then adjusting and modifying the legislation to take account of some of the negative externalities that biofuel production produced.
Right. And this is a good example of iterative policy making. On the one hand, highlighting that it's important to get things as right as possible from the off, but also that there are opportunities to refine as you go.
And as scientific understanding develops or economic realities become clear.
Exactly.
As Bayana points out, I think this clearly has real relevance to biomass-based CDR. So many of the challenges that we've discussed in the past relating to biochar, BECCS, reforestation, for example, have all been faced by biofuel.
Interesting. No wheels to be reinvented here. We just need an occasional history lesson. It does always repeat itself.
As we touched on today, and as we explore next episode, a lot of CDR policy hopes rest on both improving the voluntary market for removals and integrating them into compliance markets. And during our conversation, Bayana also reflected on the fact that we have a whole history here too that we can learn from.
So nice to have lots to learn from.
The other source of learnings and the other source of experience for this particular use is the voluntary carbon market and everything that has been happening there. And I think there we learned kind of the hard way that by writing methodologies that sound good on paper, we don't fully control for quality of the projects themselves, because the projects come in their local context, and that can be quite complex. It's very hard to write a methodology that would take into account all of this intricacy of the project local context, etc. And so we've seen in the VCM that even as methodologies improved and are continuously improving, it wasn't really until rating agencies came in, started rating the projects, giving them the kind of letter rating scores, that we were able to really have a much more comprehensive view of the quality of the projects in the market and being able to start making decisions, taking the quality aspect into account. And I think there's also, there's just a wealth of knowledge and experience now within the rating agencies around quality and risk of these projects. So yeah, I am kind of a little bit nervous that right now the policy is sort of aiming to control for risk, mostly by setting eligibility for like sector level and methodology level, because so much of the risk is set at the project level.
Bayana's take touches on a big theme. Both building trust in voluntary markets and integrating CDR into compliance markets is going to require robust measures to ensure project quality, sustainability, and so on. However, as we know, these projects operate in very diverse contexts, and there are always many on-the-ground complexities. For Bayana and B0, ratings agencies are going to be key to bridging that gap.
Whatever we think the solutions are, it's clear that policy needs to be incredibly sensitive of and responsive to local and individual contexts, or at least make space for these and keep them in mind.
We started at the top with the big picture, CDR as a solution to a global problem and as a response to commitments made under the Paris Agreement. And we've ended this episode with CDR policy needing to accommodate the many different realities on the ground, deal with many different existing laws and regulations, and interact with just about every level of government.
Yeah, great. Sounds simple enough.
Why do you think we made a miniseries about this?
And not just one episode. So, at the beginning of this episode, we had some questions. What do we mean when we're talking about CDR policy? Why do we need it? And why do we all need to know about it? Did we answer those questions? I, for one, certainly feel clearer on some of these. I really appreciate the understanding of where CDR policy fits in the bigger picture of climate and environmental policy, and also how we might start to build that CDR policy and what we need to bear in mind as we're doing so. How do you feel, Tom?
Well, I feel as though I have a better handling of what policy actually means, first and foremost. and an appreciation for the complexity with which policy can be made at an international level and then also at a small municipal level.
Mm-hmm. I still have a lot of questions about this, and particularly, what does it all actually look like? How does it work? I want to dive deeper, Tom.
Well, Emily, in the next episode, we're going to be doing just that. We're going to be looking at a few examples in particular, and also taking a broader look at the carbon markets, how they've developed so far, and what impact future policy may have on them.
Wonderful. All my questions will be answered. See you next time.
See you soon. Thank you for listening to the Carbon Removal Show.
Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow us. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads. It helps so much.
And if you could do me this one favour, share this podcast with a friend or a colleague who might resonate with this episode.
A huge thank you to all our coalition members, without whom the Carbon Removal Show would not be possible.
B0, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Gap, Carbon Future,
ClimeFi, Ivatama, Klarna, Matchmakes,
Milky Wire, Negative Emissions Platform, OPNA,
Patch, Pinwheel, Plan Boo, Recarber,
Sebastian Manhart, Standard Gas Technologies, Supercritical, and Offstream.
If you or your company are interested in joining this amazing coalition, please get in touch.
The Carbon Removal Show is hosted by me, Tom Praviti,
And me, Emily Swaddle.
And produced by me, Ben Weaver-Hings.